from KYW,
Yes,
because
exactly. Oh,
covering
that's right, sure.
national stories, you covered for
The
you
Westinghouse.
covered for Westinghouse
Sure. Good
Broadcast
point.
News.
Good point. But some of the stories you covered, I mean, you traveled with Kennedy during
Yeah,
the campaign.
that I got through Ray Miller. Ray
Mm-hmm.
Miller, he said to me, he said, you know, you got to get to know this guy Kennedy. And I said, well, I'd like to. He said, and I know Ray Miller through, must have told the GM or the PD or whoever, hey, put Schreiber, send him up to Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm.
And they also sent Mike Preeley, who was a wonderful anchorman and newsman.
Oh, sure, another legend.
And he later went to New York and became news director at WNEW,
Mm-hmm.
which was a wonderful station in New York.
Sure.
Well, Mike and I went to Milwaukee, covered Kennedy. Mike came back, though. He had to come back earlier than I did, and I stayed longer. And that was my first meeting with Bobby Kennedy, Jackie, and Mike. In those days, no cell phones, no satellites.
Sure.
And and can you believe that sometimes I was covering Jack Kennedy when he was being interviewed on a television station, and the only people, Sander Van Oker from NBC,
Mm-hmm.
an AP reporter, and myself. Can you imagine? Today there'd be 300 reporters.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, and Jackie and the three reporters, maybe sometimes Bobby, sometimes Larry O'Brien, sometimes Ken O'Donnell, but we waited in the corridor and just shot the breeze while Jack was being interviewed.
Sure.
Yeah.
You also bring a very poignant story about you covered his funeral as well.
Yes, that was tragic, and I made one of my great faux pas that is still unfortunately on tape with a lot of mostly broadcasters. What happened was, as soon as I was news director, of course, as you said, at KYW. Mm-hmm. Jim Snyder was the bureau chief in Washington. Westinghouse had built a news department and a national news department of foreign news and national news. We had bureaus in, at that time, London, and then we had stringers around Europe, and then a few people in Washington. Snyder called me as soon as Kennedy was pronounced dead, said, get to Washington as fast as you can. Mm-hmm. I flew to Washington, and in fact, Pierre Salinger was holding a news conference that in about an hour, and I covered that. And then we got our assignments, and I was assigned to the Capitol Rotunda as well as to the gravesite. Mm. And when I was describing what was happening at the Capitol Rotunda, I was with a colleague by the name of Ann Corick. Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful woman who was the first president of the woman president of the Correspondents Association.
Really?
In Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And she and I were covering the Capitol Rotunda. When you've seen the pictures, when Jackie and Caroline walked up to the catafalque, flag draped, and Jackie leaned over, kissed the flag, mm-hmm. I started to break up. I couldn't continue. In my earphone, Jim Snyder was saying, send it back here, send it back here. And I said, this is Ann Corick with Art Schreiber at the Capitol Rotunda.
Well, you know, under the circumstances, I think.
And so I still live with that faux pas. Oh. But it's not as bad as Jerry Landay and I were assigned to the gravesite. Uh-huh. And when we got out there, the sheet we got was just who was going to be, but not what they were going to do. And like it would say Marine Corps Band, mm-hmm. but it didn't tell you what the Marine Corps Band was playing or was going to play.
Sure.
So while we're at the gravesite, we're on the air, and then Landay and I say, ladies and gentlemen, United States Marine Corps Band. And we tell the, say, bring the pot up and the band up and we'll go down.
Sure.
And when it ended, the song ended, Landay jumps in and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Marine Corps Band and bless this house." And I said to myself, I wish I were that good that I could just name a song and say it, and it intimidated me, something awful. But anyway, we got through that. We wrap up and go back to the office, and now it's all over. And the bureau, we walk into the bureau, and the bureau chief says, "Landay, where did you get that idea was bless this house? It wasn't bless this house." I thought, oh, am I glad I didn't say that.
Well, we talk about the events of November 1963, which still, are obviously very much with us in many ways. But, and we had a very hard winter after that, as I recall. The whole Northern Hemisphere did.
That's right.
So it was worldwide mourning. But then in February 1964, Ed Sullivan introduces the Beatles a few months later, and we needed something to kind of hang on to, and all of a sudden the world was in color again, and you became very closely associated with that band because of KYW.
That's right.
But there was hesitation at first, wasn't there? I mean, they didn't want to send you out with
Oh, no. See, I came back from lunch one day, I went by the program director's office and walked in to shoot the breeze, and all the jocks were sitting around, along with the production manager, the music director, even the public affairs director, and it was like a wake. It was dead silence. I said, "What happened?" And a voice said, excuse me, a voice said, "HK got the Beatles."
Oh, boy.
Now, WHK was our major competitor.
Sure, yeah.
And so I don't know what possessed me, Mike, but I looked at the program director and I said, "Why don't you put me on the Beatles tour?"
Wow.
Oh, he jumped up. And he went in the manager's office. They had to call Washington, the bureau chief, to get his permission. He did not want it because I was assigned to cover the Alabama delegation at the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City.
Okay.
And see, I had covered civil rights so much and traveled Martin Luther King.
Sure.
And on the Selma to Montgomery March, etc. Knew Bull Connor, who was then the head of the Highway Patrol of Alabama. George Wallace appointed him, but he had been the police chief of Birmingham when it was burning up. I knew all those people, so I was assigned to the Alabama delegation. Snyder did not want me covering the Beatles. Well, they went over his head to the executive vice president of the company, and they compromised. I had to cover the Democratic Convention. Jim Stagg, a disc jockey, covered the Beatles on the first week where they started out in the West. Then they came to New York, and I joined them in New York at the old Forest Hills Tennis Complex. I came up from Atlantic City, and that's where I joined them. And I was with them the next 3 weeks and played Monopoly with John and George night after night after night.
Oh.
And but Paul McCartney saved my career. Because
fascinating story. Tell us about that, because I think a lot of people don't realize you were not allowed to get autographs or anything.
No, and we had made a pledge with the Beatles that we would never ask for autographs.
Sure.
Snyder, who now was angry with me because he didn't like the fact I was on the tour, he didn't think it was an important story, and wouldn't even talk to me when I would call in my stories. He called me in Milwaukee. We were in Milwaukee, and he said, "My daughter is going to see the Beatles when they come to Baltimore. I want the autographs." I said, "Jim, I can't do it." He hung up on me. I knew I was in deep trouble. We were on our way back for the final leg now. The tour was ending. We were on our way back to New York. The Beatles were to perform that night at the Paramount Theater and go home the next day. I sat with Lennon all the time on the plane. McCartney came up and Lennon had gone somewhere. And Paul said, "Where's John?" And I said, "I don't know." And he started to walk away. I said, "Paul, do me a favor." He said, "What?" I said, "My boss, would you say something to his daughter?" And he saw me fumbling with grabbing my tape recorder. And he said, "Turn it on." And I have that cut, which I said, "I'm with Paul McCartney. We're on our way to the last performance, and they go home tomorrow." But I said, "Paul, Margaret Ann Snyder saw you in Baltimore. She waved to you, and she thinks you waved back." And McCartney says, of course I did." I looked out there and saw, I said, "That's Margaret Ann Snyder." and he moves on and says, "She's a fair-haired girl with a black penknife." and he talks to her.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful. When I got back to Cleveland, I had an engineer put that on cassette and sent it to Snyder with no note. And a week later, he called me up and he said, "We had a babysitter last night, and I took the babysitter home. When I came back, I went by Margaret Ann's room. I thought I heard something. I pushed the door open. She was laying there wide awake with the tape recorder right by her ear, and she looked up at me and said, 'He said my name.
Yeah.
He said my name.'"
That's called job security, isn't it? Well, you know, the other thing I want to point out to our audience is if you ever get a chance to see Art, and he's done these presentations before, I was very honored to actually see one of them where you actually play the tape.
Oh, yes.
Which is amazing.
I did, as we're taping this, I did last night at the Tri-C
the archives of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Archives and Library. I did a performance last night, which was wonderful. I've sold out 150 people, and then I sold my book afterwards.
Yeah.
But I do those presentations. This month of October, I'll be in Utah, then Colorado, back to Ohio and Columbus. Then I go to Bainbridge Island, Washington, and then to Niagara Falls.
Oh, so you're on the tour.
Yeah.
The book is Out of Sight, Blind and Doing All Right by Art Schreiber. With a wonderful career, things were not always good, and I think that well, actually, it was as early as 1969 you had some problems with your retina, is that correct?
Yeah, I lost a side of one eye due to a detached retina, and they could not get, had 4 surgeries, couldn't get sight restored because the macula moved. Macula is what gives you your acuity vision and your 20/20 vision. I just couldn't get me sight in that eye, but my doctor told me, he said, "Art, someday we might need that, and I'm not going to fool with it anymore. You've got a good eye," and so we just let it go. And
so you adapted, yeah.
Sure. And so in August 22nd, 82, I woke up and the lights were out. I was blind in the other eye.
Really?
And
it just happened that quickly.
That's what the book is about.
Sure.
I hope the book helps people who are losing their sight or have gone blind, because, Mike, the biggest problem with blindness is our attitudes about blindness. And also the fact that people who are losing vision or go blind, they just think life is over and they sit around. And the best advice I have ever been given was my friend Jerry Landay, who I told about. He and I covered the graveside of the Kennedy funeral.
Sure.
He later was working for the old Charles Kuralt Sunday morning show as a correspondent. And I was going through all these eye surgeries, totally blind, and he called me up, and he said, "I just did a feature on a reading machine. You got to get this. You got to get it. Here's the number." And I handed the phone to my nurse, and she copied the number. And I called this man, David Tiki, in Boston. He worked for Xerox Corporation, the manufacturer at that time of the Kurzweil reading machine. Now, I didn't know the machine was $35,000 and the size of a small washing machine. and I said, I want this reading machine. And I'm going on, and he's saying, wait a minute, and he's trying to ask me questions, and I kept interrupting him. And he